Kevin, man, thanks so much for coming on the show here today. Super excited to have you back on. What's new in your neck of the woods, man? What's been going on?
I appreciate you having me, Mike. As I've told you before, I'm a longtime listener of the Physical Preparation Podcast and appreciate everything you're doing for the industry. So
thank you.
Honored to be a guest here. New for me, obviously we have rolled into our off-season program at work, and this time of year, a little bit of a balance of we have some guys in town that are still training, but then also looking at we have a development camp coming up in a few weeks. We have the draft right prior to that. We just came off the combine, so a little bit more focus too on the next generation of hopefully NHL players that we're working with here. So it's been good, and then obviously just trying to make up for lost time and spend as much time with the family as I can here.
Absolutely. And for those of our listeners that are unfamiliar with you, would you give us like the formal bio, who you are, where you're at, title, role, all that good stuff?
Sure. Yeah, I'm the head performance coach for the Boston Bruins. I'm entering my 6th year in Boston. Prior to that, I was fortunate to spend a couple years as an assistant with Mike Potenza in San Jose with the Sharks. And prior to that, I spent 7 years in the private sector, 5 of which I was also working with the USA Hockey Women's Olympic team. So that's kind of the quick and dirty.
I love it, man. And for those that are watching, man, this guy's got the hockey beard and everything, man. You look like you fit just right into the game.
Yeah, no, I've always been told I had a face for radio, so I think I try to hide behind the beard as much as possible here, but...
You and me both, man. That's I don't know who talked me into the video podcast, but I'm giving it a run. So, man, I've got like all kinds of different questions I want to ask you here today, because sometimes we'll like deep dive on one specific area, but with you, I've got a whole bunch of different things, from career development to hockey training to some of the things that you're putting out on social media. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about actually comes from one of my online clients. And I thought this was such a great question, because in the hockey world, obviously FAI, when you're talking about impingements and these sorts of things going on at the hip, how are you guys going about programming and trying to find ways to work around these issues, or maybe work to prevent them with some of your younger athletes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when you're looking at any injury, there's really two broad speaking strategies. You can add some things that you're hoping are going to help the situation, and you can remove things that may be provocative for the situation. And, I think for us, it's a matter of really trying to wrap our head around the individual limitations that a player may present with. So, where are they in, are we looking at potentially some concerning resting positions and movement pattern biases that we think may lead to more premature closure of the front of the hip joint. And we're looking at that as potentially a long-term risk factor for the development of FAI. So,
yep.
That's a case where maybe there isn't the player's structure has not progressed to a point where there's a significant structural limitation now, but there's a movement tendency that's of concern.
Yes.
Another case may be where a player structure has progressed to a point where there's a movement limitation, and then just trying to understand how that's affecting their movement. So how does that how does their hip structure interact with their ankle structure and mobility, with their thoracic spine rotation, and some of these other factors that are going to influence how they move more globally, and maybe how they're positioning and sequencing movement. And then, I think we can look at strategies that address those things differently. Meaning, if there's a player that has some anterior core weakness, maybe has more of an anterior weight bearing bias, we can look at coaching strategies and some core training strategies that may help to address that, help get them centered over their feet a little bit more, help, kind of reestablish that rib cage stacked over the pelvis position, and then, go down that road. If a player has a more progressive structural limitation, then, we might look at what's the best way to minimize this being provocative. A common finding in ice hockey players is that they have a stiff posterior hip capsule, right? So what can we do from a daily preparation standpoint to, help minimize that, then exacerbating their structural limitation, for example? The other part, which is, I think, equally as important, is just being really conscious of how we're coaching movement and what exercises we're asking players with those significant limitations to perform. Because, at the end of the day, there's that structure of having a either overgrown acetabular hood or femoral head neck offset, both of which limit hip flexion. And most of the time it's some combination of both of those limitations in players. We know that is going to cause some issues down the road, right? So we have to, and then in a sport like hockey, where you're in a deep hip flexion position for the bulk of the time you're on the ice, you're repetitively going through extreme ranges of motion through the hip at high velocities, at high volumes. In our setting, 6 days a week, typically, there's an element of the game itself has become a bit of an occupational hazard for that structure. So we need to be extra conscious about not adding more wear and tear to a joint that is already in at an at-risk position and is being asked to perform movements that are already going to add some stress to it. So so what does that look like in an actual training standpoint? I think, obviously there's a high degree of individuality to it, but just limiting hip flexion depth on a lot of different patterns, even in half kneeling positions. Sometimes we are putting pads or some sort of bolster under the back knee so that the front hip isn't limiting and causing a pelvic tilt that we don't want. So just being really conscious about, if we're loading through the spine in any capacity, that there's not movement through the spine while it's under load. So, what is that point of hip flexion where a player starts to tuck their pelvis under, where they hit and you start to see some sort of lateral tilt, and then just bringing that to the player's awareness so that they have a better understanding of, deep and all the way down for you is here. So in everything that we're doing, try to find that spot and just hit that spot every time, but don't push past that.
Yeah. It's something I feel like I've talked about for years. I call it your functional range. Everybody has this model or this idea of what full range is, but full range, like you said, is very individual and depends on where somebody moves, what compensations they have. And, true full range isn't a great idea for everybody based on, like you said, like their body structure, their architecture, potential compensations that they're demonstrating. Like just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean that you should.
No, it's a great way to describe it. And I think, another thing that probably gets overlooked a lot is just the relationship between the length of the femur and the length of the torso. And when you're doing an exercise like a back squat or a front squat or even a goblet squat, the load is always kind of centered over the midfoot. So if that bar is on your back, your torso has to lean further forward to keep it over your midfoot. So if you have short femurs and a long torso, you may be able to perform a back squat with a more upright torso. If you have long femurs and a relatively short torso, you're going to be in more of a hip hinge deadlift pattern with that bar on your back. And that obviously changes the shearing forces that are going through your spine. And then you layer in, potentially a hip flexion limitation, and, that can cause, some premature, the pelvis is rotating backwards and then creating some segmental shearing stress in addition to what the bar is causing. So, I think over the years, you just kind of develop a intuition and an eye test that, you have a sense of, this exercise probably isn't a great fit for this player based on their structure, based on their movement archetype. And, typically, obviously, you can layer in the player's preferences and what they've done successfully, if they've had any issues with certain exercises in the past, and find some common ground on what's an exercise that's going to deliver what we're hoping to get out of of that block of that day of the training program that also then fits their structure and minimizes the risk of suffering any sort of setback or, just unnecessary wear and tear.
Sure. And remind me, are you a massage therapist or did you get a degree or something in that realm?
I would describe myself as a non-practicing massage therapist. Yeah, I got my massage license and that's still current, but we're fortunate to have, I work in the building with 3 physical therapists, an athletic trainer, a full-time massage therapist, a part-time massage therapist. We have 2 chiropractic consultants that have excellent soft tissue skill sets. So I'm fortunate that I'm not needed in that area in my current position.
Well, okay, but this leads me beautifully into my next question. Thinking about integration, right? So when you start talking about this person has a stiff posterior hip, what level of integration do you guys have, or would you like to have to help fix some of these issues, right? Because, there are some people that are more malleable than others, right? If you got a 38-year-old vet, maybe they're not as malleable as the 22-year-old kid that's fresh-faced and coming off the combine. But what level of integration do you guys have access to really try and make some impactful change? Or if nothing else, just keep these guys healthier for a longer period of time?
Yeah, we, our medical staff and our performance staffs this past off season got together and spent a lot of time talking about the model that we wanted to work under collectively moving forward. We put together a mission statement, a set of core values that were common to us as an entire cohesive department. And awesome. I think part of the goal with that was to just really establish that we are one unit, all pulling towards the same goal. And not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but I think traditionally people assign certain responsibilities to certain roles based on the title. And then as a result of that, things that may happen throughout the season are then attributed as, successes or failures for one department. And the example that I would give is if a player comes back from an injury and they get re-injured, who takes the blame for that? Who's typically assigned the blame for that? And, I think most people listening would say it's probably the medical staff. They cleared them prematurely. Another case is if a player comes back and they don't perform well, whether that's because the coach thinks they're not in good enough shape or whether their skill level and execution isn't up to par, you might look at that and say, well, that's a performance department issue. And if you look under the hood a little bit, sometimes what you see is that, a player is being held back from performing activity by a medical staff because they are hyper-focused on allowing an injury to heal. So the performance staff is handcuffed in what they're allowed to do with that player until the player's injury, quote unquote heals. And then it's, okay, now he's cleared. And, the performance staff may have days or, maybe a week or so to ramp that player back up. And then they're thrown right back into competition. Well, in that example, the player's lack of conditioning and lack of execution in their return really stems back to that athlete not having an opportunity to continue to train during the injury healing process. Right. And the same theme of discussion could be used with the other example where, if you have a medical staff that's fully supportive of the performance staff, working around an injury and getting that player active early on, and the performance staff is picking the wrong exercises. They're not successfully working around the limitation. They're not anticipating the trickle-down effect of that limitation and how that may affect the player's movement, how that player may be biasing more stress towards different segments to offload the injured area. If those things aren't accounted for, and then the player returns and gets re-hurt, or if there aren't enough stresses that are within sport that are strategically ramped up to allow that player to transition smoothly, well, now the re-injury can really be reframed as a performance department failure of process. And,
Right.
I think in both those examples, the take home message there is that it's nobody's fault, but it's all of our responsibility to make sure that we're putting the player in the best position possible to return from those situations. So with our staff, we have strongly internalized that feeling. And we meet on a daily basis to talk about everybody. So if anything, a player takes a puck off the foot in the game before, and we anticipate that affecting their training availability or potentially their practice status, or how much load we want to put that player under from a practice standpoint, we have all those discussions every single morning so that when we separate and mobilize all the resources we're fortunate to have in the organization, we're making sure that the players are being exposed to stresses that may help in an injury or an ailment recover and heal, or re-strengthen and recondition, and then also making sure that we're on the same page for what that player should be avoiding in the interim.
Gotcha. Very cool. Okay. I am very interested in your current thoughts on movement variability. Obviously, a very hot topic, say 5 to 10 years ago. I know something you and I both still hold a certain amount of respect for. So kind of two questions here. Number one, where does it fit into an individual program? Like a program you write for a month. And then from that same perspective or that same lens, where does it fit into the bigger picture of an entire off season?
Yeah, movement variability, I look at not just as a series of exercises that you implement at different stages throughout the annual cycle, but just as much as a philosophy and way of looking at things. And, from my perspective, movement variability can kind of be bucketed into two general categories. There's micro movement variability, which is on the individual joint level, and then macro movement variability, which is more on global movement patterns and movement sequencing. And, from a micro movement variability standpoint, every joint has a physiologically full range of motion that joint is intended to go through. And I think what can happen sometimes is players get into these habits or routines of, just kind of hammering mobility through a single pattern or single direction. And, the analogy that I use is if you go to the beach and you have a bucket of water and there's a flat patch of sand and you dump that water onto the sand slowly, what happens is that water, because there are no restraints on where it goes, that water will spread out across the sand, and there's really no significant change there's no deformation to the sand. You're not getting a huge hole. There's not a lot of erosion from the water, right? But if you take your finger and you just draw a little path in the sand, and then you pour that bucket of water down that path, that water is then going to pick up sand on the edges, and that path that you just drew is going to become a little bit wider and a little bit deeper. And the easiest example of that I think most people, particularly us in the United States, are familiar with is the Grand Canyon. That's essentially how that was formed over a prolonged period of time, that, you get the water from the river, and then, obviously the wind that comes in afterwards, and it digs this massive groove through the earth. So, what does that mean for joint range of motion? It means that if stress only has one path where it's clear to go through, that's where it's going to go over and over and over and over and over. And you're then more likely to create excessive wear or tear or stress through specific segments of a joint, instead of that force being more evenly distributed around the whole joint. So from an application standpoint for that concept, I think, returning back to some of the 3D flexibility and joint mobility concepts that were probably more popular 20 years ago than they are now. I think one of the things that we do is we have a constantly changing, pre-practice preparation routine where there are just very subtle differences in the directions and positions and patterns that we're using to help open up range of motion in a specific area. So, I mentioned the posterior hip capsule as being a point of emphasis in hockey players and just trying to maintain some length in that area. So for us, there's an exercise called a supported hip airplane that, when you open up the hip, you get some good length through the adductor, particularly the adductor magnus. And when you close down, if you do it the right way, you should get a little bit of a stretch in the posterior hip capsule. So that is different from a lateral hip rock where you start in a quadruped position and then, cross one knee over the opposite ankle and then shift your hips into that side to get some motion in that posterior hip capsule. That's slightly different from going through a similar pattern, but in more of a pigeon pose position, from that the yogis on listening may be familiar with. So
yeah,
all three of those address the posterior hip capsule. All three of those do that in a slightly different way and in a slightly different direction. So, there's a ton of examples of different ways that you can execute that, whether you're integrating, you're integrating multiple directions within a set routine, or whether you're rotating routines, on a daily or weekly basis to make sure that you're tapping into opening up the joint from multiple directions. I just think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, where you're not just hammering the same routine in the same direction over and over and over and over, because you may be creating some laxity in areas that is going to compromise your joint stability over time, while also minimizing the opportunity for that joint to disperse force evenly throughout it. So that's my view on micro variability. From a macro variability standpoint, it's a similar thought process, but now you're looking at the control of the body in different patterns that allows the body to find a solution to unique movement requirements. So, I think from a dynamic warm-up standpoint, there are lots of opportunities to include movement in different directions that are challenging coordination and the body's ability to navigate, moving in different directions with different body orientations, going from single to double leg stance, and vice versa, controlling single leg, hopping, bounding, just finding ways that a place to fit those types of patterns. I also think from a strength training standpoint that there's a trade-off between if you default back to having a very small number of primary exercises, then the athletes are going to get very good at performing those exercises. But the transfer of the strength that's developed in those exercises to patterns outside of those exercises will become compromised.
Yep.
So, I think that there's a trade-off to, you need enough repetition of a pattern for the athlete to develop competence in that pattern. But if you want to maximize the transfer of that strength to sport, I think there's a lot of value in developing that strength through different movement patterns. So, there's still an ongoing debate between single leg and double leg training. Within single leg dominant training, there's, unsupported other leg. There's split stance positions. There's, dynamic lunging positions where you're going from single leg support to double leg support, but in a staggered position. You have, sagittal plane, transverse plane, frontal plane dominant patterns for each of those. And, I think ultimately to maximize the transfer to a dynamic environment, certainly like hockey, and I would argue most team sports, there's an argument to be made that you really need to develop strength using some combination of all of those patterns.
Dude, that answer was so good. I mean, I just want to start with this idea of, I guess I hadn't thought of it this way, but movement variability is just it's baked into my philosophy as well. It's not like a thing, I'm constantly trying to check that box, obviously at the start of an off season, when people have probably lost or progressively lost it over the course of an in-season competition, travel, all that, it tends to shrivel, right? So obviously it's a big emphasis at the start, but I love that idea of just keeping it in. I mean, that's what I've done. I feel like pretty well over the years is always try and keep that in. And second, I love your idea of strength across kind of all these different planes, right? Because I'm sure you've seen it as well, right? The guy that's got like a 500-pound squat, but then you put him in a single leg squat position and he's falling over. Or you try and make him go side to side in what we would call a frontal transverse plane type lunge. It's like 12 pounds, right? They have no strength, stability, control in those positions. So I love that idea of, sure, there's a time and a place for just pure output, right, in those big bang lifts, but being strong, like you alluded to, frontal plane, transverse plane, single leg, split stance, all these different postures and positions is probably the best way to look at it for most sports.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I also think, and I don't know if we want to dive down this hole today or not, but, this is part of the reason why playing multiple sports at young ages is so powerful. Even if you know that you only want to focus on hockey or basketball or soccer as you get older, being exposed to all of these different movement patterns, movement skills, controlling implements with your feet, with your hands, projectiles moving towards you and away from you in sports like lacrosse and baseball. All of those things are teaching your body how to control and move in these different patterns. And that's one thing that I've really come to appreciate over the last several years working at this level is just how incredible the top end talent players are at controlling their body to find solutions to be able to execute a skill under really challenging environments. And, you see a few years ago, there was a incredible goal that Alexander Ovechkin scored. This might be over a decade old now. I'm losing track of time as I get older, but he kind of got tripped up, and as he's spiraling through the air, he puts his stick behind his head and then hits the puck into the net while he's in midair. I think he's a guy, David Pasternak on our team's a guy that is known for setting up on a particular area of the ice and taking one-timers, especially on the power play, and finding success there. And, I think you look at those and it's the same shot type from the same general shot location. Sometimes it goes into the same spot on the net, and it's like, well, that's the same pattern. And the reality is that the puck is coming in from a slightly different place every time. The way that their body is facing is often in a different place. How long they've had to set up and where their weight is distributed is different. How they follow through. Sometimes they drop down to one knee. Sometimes they're able to stay more upright. Where is the defensive pressure coming from? What are the ice conditions? Where is the goalie moving? And when you look at those, there are subtle nuances that they are navigating in real time at exceptionally high speeds that allow them to execute the skill in a unique environment consistently. And it just so happens that a lot of those players also played lots of different sports growing up. But, that's one way where you can maximize the athlete's ability at younger ages to learn that body control and to really challenge it in different ways, while also, minimizing some of the negative effects of just hammering the same sport year round, which physically and psychologically is counterproductive in most cases.
Well, our mutual friend, Eric Cressy, just posted something in the last couple of weeks talking about how, with a lot of these young baseball players, they'd be better off just playing multiple sports and then not even playing travel baseball until they're, mid-teenagers, right? I think he said 15 or 16 years old, because I've got kids in my neighborhood now that are 10 or 11 years old and playing 70 plus baseball games every summer. That's half a major league schedule, dude. That's insane when you think about it like that.
Yeah. And, I think Eric reposted that from several years ago, which just shows that this is an ongoing battle. And, the reality is that a lot of those quote unquote off season spring leagues and tournament teams and exposure camps are very financially lucrative for people. And that's why they continue to persist. And that's why there's such a consistent effort to convince parents that those are completely necessary. But years ago, I was working with a youth hockey team that was a U16 team that played over 90 games in their season.
Oh my gosh.
So that's more than an NHL team plays. So, I think it's gotten completely out of hand. And, hopefully there's more people like Eric. I know he shared some information from James Andrews too that is sharing a similar message. I know Lee Taft, who's a friend of the show, has been outspoken on the issue too. So hopefully more people that understand the development process and understand the social, the psychological, but even just the athletic consequences of early specialization continue to speak up about it.
Well, one thing that'll be interesting as you continue to hang out and you do these combines and all that, I think it was Lee that told me this, but what you're seeing at the NBA level is when these guys go in and do their combines and they do their medicals, like sometimes their knees as teenagers, as early 20-year-olds look like they're in their 30s because they played so much. So you're seeing these like very early onset degenerative changes in key joints. So I wonder if you guys will see that trend if you continue to see kids, playing more than an NHL season before they've even gotten to you.
Yeah, I think that has already started to show itself within our sport. There was a study, I think it was published in 2013 from Philippon's group out in Colorado that looked at, they MRI'd the hips of youth hockey players and essentially found that there was a progressive increase from, in hockey, they're called peewees, bantams, and midgets, but the age groups are, in that 11, 12 to 13, 14, 15 to then 16 through 18. And, essentially what they found is by the time players reached the U18 level, over 90% of them had a hip structure that could be diagnosed as FAI, and 100% had labral tears. So in that, there was a linear increase across those three different age groups to get to that point. So, I think there's probably some messages there about the imaging process, and there's a word of caution to be careful what you look for because you're going to find something if you look in the right places based on the sport, but also just what the current landscape of youth sports is causing from a structural adaptation standpoint. And I also think that we're living in a time. I remember years ago when I was a grad student at UMass, we had a physical activity lab where they were doing research on, the epidemiological factors that lead to health issues. And there was an interesting finding from one of the studies that I remember them talking about that, you have these markers of physical activity that if people hit certain thresholds of, time accumulated in moderate physical activity, that risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, a lot of these common health issues decrease when you hit that threshold. But it was interesting that inactive time was an independent risk factor. And, I think that caught the attention of a lot of the grad students because a lot of us spend all day in classes,
sitting behind a desk,
TAs, then going into a lab, and you sit all day long, and then, maybe you're going out for a bike ride or a run or going to the gym, and you're going hard for that hour. But then, the other 15 hours of your waking day, you're sitting and completely inactive. Right. And I think there's an element of that with youth sports today too, that kids, we have physical education classes that are being cut. We have longer time in classrooms with less recess, and there's just more inactive time, but then also more highly competitive youth sport. So there's less just free play activity time for the kids. So something else to think about.
Absolutely, man. Okay. I'm really interested in this topic because something that you've been talking about, I know I just did an entire show with Matthew Ibrahim talking about this. How are you training the brakes, so to speak? So the brakes and deceleration with your athletes these days.
Yeah, I think we look at it from a few different lenses. One is, what are the positions that players are in when they're transitioning? So, in our sport, and this is probably common across most field sports as well, but, there's a lot of deep hip and knee flexion positions. There's a lot of angled segments. For us, there's some inside leg loading and some outside leg loading, depending on the pattern. The push-off directions out of those transitions can be unique in a consideration. But so we look at, what can we do to help make sure that the player can get into those positions? So whether that's, mobility work, whether that's stability work, whether that's just training a player to understand what that position should feel like when they're in it. So there's the movement training side of it. Then there's does the player have the strength to get into and control those positions? So we'll put a focus on isometric strength in some of those deep positions, in addition to, even just prolonged eccentric work, hitting that position, pausing, and then coming out of it fast to help improve the eccentric strength and the tissue strength going into those positions. And then the last one, which, I think is, well, I shouldn't say the last one. Then there's also the traditional jump training and, making sure that both from a jump progression standpoint and even a sprint progression standpoint, that players are able to quickly get into those positions, control them, and then get out of them. So, some of our single leg bounding patterns, even some of our, hurdle hop progressions are emphasizing hitting some of those deeper positions at angles and then transitioning out of them. So I think the gap that we've identified in our strategy really centers around loaded eccentric rate of force development, where, we have some of these, every strategy that you use falls somewhere along the force velocity continuum, right? So,
yep.
We have some of these heavy resistance, eccentric strength oriented strategies. And then we have some of these strictly body weight, eccentric loading strategies as far as jump landings and transitions, jump transitions, sprint transitions, those sorts of things. And more in the middle there is eccentric rate of force development work, where we're trying to emphasize an overload element of hitting the brakes as fast as possible. And, I posted a video the other week of just a forward lunge, hitting in the bottom position and trying to hit the brakes as fast as possible, which is different than letting your foot hit with your knee just slightly bent and then absorbing it all the way down into the bottom position. The focus here is really hit in the bottom and don't move, so that there's a very small arc of movement, a very high, deceleration impulse.
Yep.
And then teaching that, and then knowing that because of the load associated with that when we then ask them to transition back into some of the more body weight movement patterns, they're going to have a higher threshold to be able to hit those transitions at higher speeds and still control and transition out of them.
Yep. No, I love that, because this was something that, classically trained, they used to talk about, how much do they say you could lower in your squat, right? Like 140%, right? I don't know about you. I'm not loading up any of my NBA basketball players with 140% of their back squat max and trying to test their eccentric strength that way. So that didn't really work for me. But I always saw, okay, we need some slow loaded, just more strength building or force building eccentric work, but I'm 100% with you. This is where I've spent a lot of like the last two to three off seasons with these guys, is this very like impulse driven, like, hey, how quickly can we stop? And you use like the perfect term, impulse, right? So I just think of it as how quickly can we spike the brake? So if you're looking at it via biofeedback or force plates or whatever, you see that big spike so that like, hey, we're putting a lot of force into the ground. We're distributing those forces hopefully across the body. And it's a timing issue too, because you'll see a lot of younger athletes when they try and do that, it's like they'll hit and they'll wobble or whatever. The best athletes, man, they hit and they stop, and it's pretty cool to watch. It's like immediate.
No, that's exactly it. And, I suspect that if you looked at the impulses on force plates, you would see that there are some pretty significant differences between a drop squat or even a jump landing versus a loaded single leg lunge like that, where you're hitting in the bottom of the position, both in the duration of the force absorption and then the total impulse as well.
Yep. Very cool. And where are you putting this into a program? Is this something that you're like focusing on for like a specific training block? Is it something you're spreading out and kind of dosing throughout the off season? Like, where does that fit for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. We are primarily front loading that into our off season program. So we go through a initial phase that is really intended to serve as a transition for the athletes in, moving away from kind of an in-season training program or some time off after the end of the year back into our off-season program. Players are training 5 days a week. So that phase for us this year really emphasized a lot of isometric work in deep positions in a full body circuit format to, there's a few different goals there, but it's preparing the tissue to absorb more load moving forward.
Yeah.
And improving the player's work capacity. And then in the next phase, we start to introduce more sprint work as more of a technique emphasis, start to introduce a little bit of jumping, but that's where we're going to introduce our eccentric rate of force development work, like we just mentioned, and then also our eccentric strength work. So within a training day, that would fall, that example that I gave would fall very early within the day, where we want the athletes to be fresh. We want their focus and their intent to be maximal, because it is essentially a loaded power exercise within our program. And then we move into the slower stuff afterwards.
Yeah. No, it's a shift in thinking, right? Because we always think of, or we tend to think of power activities solely as like overcoming activities or explosive activities with, a jump or a clean or something like that, a box jump. You don't think of it so much in the opposite sense, where you're working on, the lowering or the deceleration component of it. But yeah, that's exactly how I'm setting it up. So for you guys, NHL, do you typically have 3 to 4 month off seasons about?
Yeah,
right.
As you can imagine, the off-season program for us is always a moving target because you never know how long of a time you're going to have until it's over. So, I think if you are fortunate to go on a long run, then you may have less than 3 months in your off-season program. Yeah. Some of the teams that are out of it a little earlier may have closer to 5, just depending on how eager players are to get started again. So for us, it's close to right in between those two. We have right around a 4-month off season. So a lot of our phases are 3 weeks typically, and that gives us some room to not just have kind of a standard, we're going to go through a anatomical adaptation and then an eccentric strength and, kind of work your way through that progression. But that gives us some flexibility too, if a player really wants to focus on different areas, we can start to shift some phases around and then add more work for the quality that is most limiting for that player in the off season. So, it also, for the players that go straight through, which, we have some of those, it builds in varying the stress, helps allow them to continue to go without building in a traditional, deload week or off week in the middle of the off season.
Right. No, that's cool. I like that a lot. And like you said, I like the idea of being able to cater to some individual needs, because, not every guy's the same, right? The guy that's 38 and has played for 18 years is probably a lot different to manage than the 22-year-old kid that's gung-ho and just coming into the league. So it gives you that ability and that freedom to make things more individual for them.
Oh, definitely. I mean, our off-season program, we have 5 tracks that players generally fall into. And then within each one of those, we will obviously comb through the program and make individual adjustments to exercise selection based on some of the factors we talked about before. But then everybody's off season is a little different too, as far as, what some guys have: weddings, honeymoons, children being born. Some players really benefit from having a slightly longer rest to start the off season. Some players prefer to jump right back into it and then, maybe sprinkle in some time off throughout the off season, depending on a lot of factors. But what that means for us is that even within those 5 tracks, we might have one player that has a 16-week off-season program and another that has a 14. We just have to make some adjustments based on the individual needs. But always the thought process is, what is in the best interest of this player, and what can we put together for them that's going to allow them to, obviously continue to capitalize on their strengths, to appreciate where they are in their development cycle and, their potential durability concerns and where they are in their career, but then also help them continue to make some progress in areas that are important for them.
Very cool. Okay, so this is actually a reader/listener question, and it actually fits in perfectly to kind of what we're talking about here. Unfortunately, I did not write down the gentleman's name, so my apologies. But he wanted to know where you guys implement your plyos in the off season if the goal is to also improve strength. So how do you find that balance there between those two?
Yeah, I think there's we just talked a little bit about how the emphasis of phases will progress throughout the off season. So, I think in a sport like hockey, there needs to be some exposure to all of the physical qualities from a bird's eye view standpoint. Even if a player says, I just want to improve speed, you can't not expose them to strength work, because at the end of the day, they're going to need that quality when they step on the ice. So
absolutely,
it's really a matter of how we're going to emphasize and prioritize phases for players with different goals. But specific to plyometric work, I think how you perform the exercises can lend itself to more, shifting a little bit more to the strength end of the force velocity continuum than others. So, loaded jumps, for example, are going to require, slower contraction times, but higher forces and higher power output. So for somebody that really needs to prioritize strength, that may be something we might prioritize loaded jumps for that athlete more than somebody that maybe is a little bit more speed driven, where we're, even if we're loading them, maybe it's at lower loads than the strength emphasis athlete. I think you can also disadvantage some positions. So, sprint starts, for example, if you start from a half kneeling or lateral half kneeling position, that's going to be a little bit more of a slower, higher impulse, higher force requirement start type for sprinting than starting upright, which there's a little less that needs to be overcome to get the athlete making forward progress there. So those are some considerations. Even just starting jumps from the bottom position, more bottoms up, split squat jumps, even box jumps starting from a bottom position. Those are all ways that within a team program, even if everybody's in there at once, you can have, one group doing something where they're starting from the bottom, another group that is emphasizing more of either a faster bias starting position or starting from a position that allows them to capitalize on a stretch reflex and stretch shortening cycle to a higher degree.
Very cool. Okay. So we've talked a lot about training. I want to talk about just life in the NHL a little bit, because we just had Lauren Lando on a couple weeks ago. Love just his thought process. He spent 5 years in the NFL with the Denver Broncos, so get a different perspective from a different sport. You've been in the NHL for a while now, right? Like you said, with San Jose, now with Boston, and this is very open-ended. What are some lessons you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I think to start, every season brings unique challenges. No 2 seasons are the same. The schedule is challenging every year, but then within that every year creates some unique challenges. So, for example, this year, we played every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday for the last 6 weeks of the year, with one exception, which I think was week 5. We did not have a game on Tuesday, but we still had Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, and the Saturday, Sunday before that. So, with that, there's some benefits to the regularity of the schedule, but the reality is what you're doing from a training standpoint, what you're recommending from a practice load standpoint, how you're helping players manage the recovery process and just manage the stress of that type of schedule is different than it would be if you're, maybe playing 13 games in a month and you have a couple 2 or 3 day windows in between games throughout that stretch. So, I think I've just really learned to appreciate that you can be very rigid in your philosophy and the general things that you think are important to the process, but you have to be very flexible in the methods and the timing of those recommendations. So that's a big one. And then, there's also just the layers of, what does your roster look like at any given moment? Do you have your full team healthy? Are you going through a phase where you might have a couple guys that have suffered injuries? How is that affecting the rest of the roster? Meaning, we in the NHL, you have 23 players that are rostered, 20 of which suit up for game night. So on any given night, you have 3 extra players. Depending on the makeup of the team, those players may be cycling in and out of the lineup on a regular basis, or they may be out of the lineup for prolonged periods of time. So, I've used the example before that I've seen players go from being a healthy scratch and out of the lineup one night, and potentially for several weeks in a row, to then being on the first line, their first game back in. So or on the first D pair where they're playing 18 to 22 minutes that next night in. So, I think keeping in mind how quickly things can change and managing, some of the, potential mental fatigue and doubt that might come in some of those players about their importance to the process and the team, and just making sure that they stay engaged and stay ready, knowing that, you're one injury away from having a very important, prominent role potentially on the team. So, I think just the importance of that, of keeping that present and not letting players slip because of the role that they're currently in. Hockey, maybe more than any other sport, there's a lot of shifting up and down in the lineup. And, one of my goals is to always keep the player prepared at a minimum to take on the next role above what they're being asked to do. So if it's a player that typically plays 12 minutes a night, if they get bumped up into a second, third line, kind of a middle 6 forward role, they might be playing 15, 16, 17 minutes a night. So, we kind of look at that and use that as a target to make sure that if players need to be doing extra work at practice or potentially some extra conditioning work at a game, that if that is then asked of them, that they are not only prepared, but then also they know that they're prepared and they feel confident that from a physical standpoint, at least, that they're going to be ready to take on that added stress. So I think those are some of the big things that just stand out, is just making sure that you plan to the extent that's possible, but then also know that, there's going to be curveballs that pop up throughout every season, and just making sure that you are prepared as the coach for those, but then also that you're keeping players prepared for those instances.
Well, and what's interesting too is if you're listening at home and you think, 12 minutes and you have to go to 15, 16, that doesn't sound too bad, until you realize, number one, the intensity level, but that's a 25 to 33% spike in workload, right? Like that's massive at the level you guys are playing at. So it may not sound like much, just, what's 3 to 4 extra minutes?
Sure.
But as to what you're compared to or what you've been training at and for to go up to that next tier, that's a big jump.
Yeah, I don't know that it's exactly an apples to apples comparison here, but if you've never skated at that level or attempted to skate at that intensity, 3 minutes of ice time is almost the feeling equivalent of 6 extra wing gates. So maybe that puts it in perspective.
6 Wingates alone was enough, man. I remember doing that one back in the day. That was not fun. Okay, next. I love hearing these. Give me a day in the life. You're in the middle of the in-season grind time. It's February, March, whatever. What does an average day look like for you? When are you in? When are you out? What do you do in between?
Yeah, we generally have 2 days. We have a practice day and then we have a game day. And the practice day, we're typically in by 6:30 to 7. Usually the staff works out together. You kind of get showered, have breakfast, and then for us, we're setting up our wearable technology units before players get on the ice. We'll meet, like I mentioned before, the medical staff, just do a quick debrief on anything that we need to be aware of, what our plans are for the day from a training standpoint. We'll review any players that are injured and what the plan is for them on and off the ice and from a treatment standpoint. We typically by 8:30 to 9, we'll have any injured players will be in the building and starting their process. So if guys, they might be getting treatment first, but then they'll come into us, warm up, potentially skate. So we'll have somebody out there that's helping with the on-ice monitoring standpoint. Then they come in afterwards and they'll work out with us after they skate most days. In parallel with that, basically when the injured players go on the ice, the rest of the team will start to trickle in. They'll go through their pre-practice warm-up process. If we have any training that day, they'll go through that as well. Then they'll go onto the ice for practice. The injured guys come off, and that's when they're training. When the players go on for practice, again, we are clipping drills and facilitating the on-ice monitoring side of things. And then when they come off, any guys that have to finish training will do that. And then, we collect all of our units, download the data, process that, and then we spend some time putting together reports and any feedback that we need to send to the coaching staff or to the medical staff afterwards. So typical practice day, we might be walking out of the rink anywhere between 2 and 2:30 in the afternoon. Game days are very similar in the morning, except instead of practice, players are coming in for either a morning skate or just meetings, treatments. Some players will go through some sort of workout the morning of a game or some sort of preparatory process. We have a few different strategies that, depending on the schedule and the time of year, we'll implement on the morning of games. And then whether they skate or not, we typically leave just a little bit earlier. You have a couple hour break in the middle of the day, and then you're back at the rink for the game at 3:30 or 4. Players start to come in afterwards. There's a balance between stocking the fridges, making sure that the supplements guys need are available, being available for any individual requests with pregame warm-ups and routines that way. And then during the first period of the game, the players that are not playing will come in and train. Then, second period, you're making post-game shakes and, we're working with the chefs to make sure the meal's set up and everything's all set there. And then after the game, oftentimes players will come in and go through some sort of quick training process or some sort of recovery and cool down before moving on. And then, obviously if we're home, the day wraps up, we're home around midnight or so. If we're traveling afterwards or if we're on the road, then you're headed to an airport, hopping on a plane and flying to the next city. So those days, I obviously can be long. You're in the facility at 6:30, 7 in the morning. You're not home till midnight on the early end. If you're on the road, you might be landing in the next city at 2 a.m. And then we ride to the rink. We help unload all the equipment, hang the players' gear so that it can dry, get back to the hotel at 3, 4 in the morning, and then start it all over again the next day. So,
oh my gosh, man. So game day, it's not like you're just sitting there having a beer watching the game. Like, you're literally working the entire game. You don't even really get to watch the game, it sounds like.
Yeah, we're, especially at home, we have TVs in our training area. So while the players are working out, we have the game on TV, but yeah, it's not like we're sitting in the stands and watching the game. And then, typically you get half a period to a period between the second and third where you can sit down and actually watch it. I like to watch it with our video coaches because you get a sense of how they're looking at it, any potential challenge opportunities, and you get a little bit of the coaching perspective on how the game's going when you're watching it with them. So I try to squeeze in as much time in that room as I can. But there's also, those are opportunities, Mike, where we have invoices that need to be filed with our accounting department. There are emails that need to be responded to both within the organization and outside of it. So a lot of times that time during the game, during the second or third periods where you have a break from actually working hands-on with the athletes, or when you try to squeeze in some of that extra work as well.
Man, so you mean like when somebody like me is spamming you in the middle of the season asking you to come on a podcast?
Yeah,
emails
exactly.
like that.
And most of my emails back are, sorry for the delayed response, but
yes, no, I know. I'm the same way.
I'd love to follow up in 4 months and I'll be right there.
That's right. That's right. Okay, couple more here. What are some mistakes you made in your 5 years being a head strength and conditioning coach? And what or how would you, or how have you changed or evolved over that time?
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind is just taking for granted what players know. And, when I first started, I had a meeting with our leadership committee and, just really quickly ran through the philosophy of things that I thought were important and why we were doing certain things, why it was important to me that we had a warm up before every practice day, why, what we were using on ice monitoring data for, and what we were not using that type of information for. And we ran through a lot of those things. And over the course of that first year, there was a lot of questions on nutrition and supplementation and within game hydration, and a lot of topics that I think are foundational performance topics to the players.
Right.
And we were fortunate in my first few years there that we had a pretty consistent roster. There wasn't a ton of turnover throughout that group. And as that started to change, as we had more players leaving and more new players coming in, I found myself answering a lot of questions that I know that I had answered before. And, it was a little bit of a aha moment for me that the players aren't thinking about this as much as the staff is, right? So,
yes.
And even if you've told them something, it's likely that over the course of weeks or months or years or seconds that they've forgotten what you've said to them about, why something might be helpful in a certain situation, or why one strategy is better in a situation than the other. So this year, what we did is we put together what, I've kind of described as an internal education campaign. And we created a series of, informational slides, some of which were more, kind of billboard, like, did you know, attention grabbing, at least that was the thought process with the headlines and imagery, to highlight some of the topics that I thought was important for players to be aware of, not just a potential benefit of a particular strategy, whether that's recovery strategy or a supplement or the importance of sleep, but it's important for them to not just know what that is and what the benefit is, but why it may work. And I think that this, passive diffusion of information is a way that players can kind of come in, seeing it may cue their memory, and then it may spark a behavior change that, or a reminder for them to get back to a particular behavior that they may have abandoned just out of falling back into certain habits and routines. So that was something that I found incredibly beneficial for our group this year, and something that will continue to evolve over the years to come, and just, even keeping the messaging the same, but rotating imagery so, players don't get sick of looking at the same thing. But, the players are consuming information on social media. They're listening to some of the same podcasts that we are, and they're getting a lot of information without necessarily the filter to understand when a strategy is really beneficial and when it can be potentially harmful for them. So that was something that we wanted to really get ahead of and, try to put our stamp on some of the big rocks and making sure that players had access to that information. And, some players are going to anchor onto that more than others, but at least then you're improving the exposure rate of some of this education information to them.
Yeah, man, I really like that. One thing I always have to remind myself of too, and I find this is true with athletes as well as young coaches, when you've worked with a certain group for a while, right? You kind of know what they know, and you can have certain conversations with them because they have that filter. They've got context built in, right? They've got experience and reps. But one thing I have to remind myself of is that just as hopefully my knowledge base grows, right? When I get somebody new, their knowledge base has not grown with me, right? Their knowledge base is still down here. So like you alluded to, I can't take for granted what they do or don't know. And that's true whether I'm talking about a new athlete or potentially a new coach, an intern that's in my gym, right? Like they still have a lot of the same questions that those interns had 10 years ago because they're here. They're starting at the base level. So I think that's so important. And I love that idea of having just like that internal messaging and having some of those, did you know? Because maybe they're just processing it, or maybe it's going to stimulate a conversation where they're like, hey, I never thought of this. Could you explain this in more depth to me? And so now you get a unique opportunity to educate some of these athletes.
Sure. Yeah. And there's an element of they now then know that we feel something is important. So maybe if it's something that they thought it was, no big deal to gloss over, or, in the case of a supplement, I'll take it when I think of it, but it doesn't really matter if I do it consistently. Right. Now there's a reinforcement that this is important, not just to us, but then there's also a real benefit to you doing it. So, I think to your point, you do have, everybody is somewhere along this education continuum. And, I think to an extent, it's important to just reinforce the basic things over and over and over too. Even if players have heard them before, just know that this is still important, even though it's not new and captivating. I think creatine is maybe a supplement that kind of falls into that category where it's been around so long that people almost forget how powerful it can be for, depending on what the goal is, obviously. But there's that. But then we also try to rotate our messages so that if we have several that are showing up on a screen, there are some that are more basic and some that are a little bit more progressive or more advanced, so that you're attempting to speak to both audiences at once. Casting
a wide net, right?
That's it.
I just bought some creatine today, man. Not for myself. I don't need any more meat, but one of my guys does. Trying to put a little meat on him. Okay, one more big question, man. What kind of professional goals have you set for yourself? Again, you've spent a lot of time in the league now. You've seen a lot of things. You've been an assistant. You've been ahead. What are your goals professionally for next season?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I mean, one, at this level for the whole organization, there's really only one goal, and that's to win, right? So everybody is working towards that from, the moment one season ends, you're immediately looking at putting yourself and doing whatever you can to help support the organization being in a position to compete for it the next year. So, that understood. I think there are a couple things. One, within our group, I think making the data that we collect from the players accessible to the players on a higher level is important to me. We've been clear from the start that their data is their data, and they're allowing us to access it to help them and help support their development and performance. That's always been my philosophy, but I think it's helpful where the players can access the information whenever they want. So we will likely look at putting together some sort of app internally so that the players have constant 24/7 access to their information, and also put together some visualizations that, again, similar to what we just talked about, maybe spark some conversations that are not happening if it's not there's a tendency to wait for the red flag or, to anticipate the red flag and then focus on that instead of maybe acknowledge some positive changes along the way as well. Or, have a player I didn't feel good. This is showing this, and maybe they become a little bit more proactive in some of those discussions as well. So that's a big one for us. And then, I think from an organization standpoint, we're clearly going through a transition this year. We're losing some prominent veteran players from our lineup, and as a result of that, we're going to go through a pretty significant change to the construction of our roster. So, I think one, just looking at the development process within the organization, and that goes all the way from, in hockey, players get drafted and then you frequently don't see them in the organization for another 2-3 years, where they're off playing with their junior team, or they're in a different country playing for a team there. Some players may go to college and they're in a college system for 3 years before signing a contract, even for our minor league team, before eventually coming to us. So, there's a 3 to 5 year window between when you draft a player and when you may actually be seeing them at the NHL level. So,
wow,
what players are doing in that time can have a significant impact on how, quote unquote, NHL ready they are when their time approaches for them to make that transition. Similar thought process at the AHL level. I think just, really working with our staff there to find opportunities to improve. And, there's obviously things that you can look at the end of every year and reflect on positively and say that, this is something that we feel we did a really good job of. And, I think if you're being honest, there's always some opportunities you can look back on and say, we can improve in this area. And that might be the strategies that you take. It might mean bolstering resources. It might mean bolstering education in certain areas. So that's where some of my attention will be focused next year is organizationally, how can our department really make a positive impact across the organization, and not just necessarily on the 20 to 23 players that are suiting up for our team on a given night.
Very cool. Okay. Home stretch, my guy. Last but not least, lightning round. 4 questions. Your answer can be as long or short as you like. All right. Number 1, I saw your post on IG about saunas. Man, first off, I need one. I was going to ask if the Bruins would buy me one, but what preference do you have there? Because I feel like there's so many different types. Is there one that you would prefer?
Yeah, so there's generally 2 types. There's an infrared, and then there's the traditional ambient heat saunas. And the general theory with the infrared saunas is that the infrared waves penetrate to deeper layers of tissue, so it can influence deeper layers of tissue and create internal temperature increases, but at lower ambient temperatures. So it's a little less uncomfortable to sit through, potentially influencing deeper tissues and delivering similar benefits.
Okay.
The reality is that the overwhelming majority of the research on saunas is on traditional ambient heat saunas. So short answer is, if I could only pick one, I would probably stick with the traditional ambient heat temperature.
Okay.
There are some companies now that are making saunas that can do both. So if you're hedging your bets, I would buy one of those. They tend to be a little bit more expensive, but I think that saunas are one of the more powerful adaptation and performance supporting modalities that we have access to, both in terms of health and athletic performance today. And I think we'll continue to see not just an increase in popularity, but in the availability of some of these products at price points that are maybe a little more tolerable for the typical person.
Yeah. Okay. Number 2, how's dad life?
Dad life is great. We were talking earlier. My son just turned 6. My daughter will turn 3 in September. So there's never a dull moment in our house. I think it's just amazing to watch how fast things change, and it's just been a lot of fun to watch how they develop and how they anchor on to certain activities and the way that their personality evolves over time. So my son, just in the last 6 to 8 months, has really latched on to sports and in almost an obsessive way. Just, everything. He loves playing baseball. He loves playing hockey. He loves shooting basketballs. He just loves being active in that way. And also is obsessed with American Ninja Warrior and this Ultimate Beastmaster show that's on Netflix. So, every day he's like climbing up the walls and swinging from the molding through our doorways. And, no broken bones yet. So it's been a lot of fun, and it's fun to watch our daughter try to keep up with him.
That's awesome, man. Number 3, I know summer is a whirlwind, right? It's your off season, but off-season workouts, combines, all the stuff that goes into drafting new players. Any summer plans you have that you're excited about?
Yeah, we have every year we have a continuing education seminar for all the strength and conditioning coaches in professional hockey. It's actually open to the public as well, but that'll take place in Phoenix in a couple weeks. So good opportunity, I think, to obviously sit down and learn from some really high caliber speakers, some people that are probably mutual friends and friends to the show. I know Anthony Donskov is speaking this year, Adam Virgil's speaking, Vicky Bendis, she'll be speaking this year as well, is a really bright mind in the speed training in hockey space. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's also an opportunity to catch up with a lot of friends and colleagues around the league. So that's in a couple weeks. And then my wife's family does a trip together every summer for a week. This year we're going to Maine together. That's
nice.
I think the 3rd week in July. So looking forward to that. And then we have some friends down in the Jacksonville area that were in New Jersey with us, and when we lived there, and they have since moved down there. So we're going to go spend some time with them later in the summer as well. So a couple things to look forward to outside of the office.
Yeah. You just need a Pacific Northwest, and then you've got all 4 corners of the United States there. That's pretty impressive.
Maybe I'll try to catch the next complete coaching certification out in
That's right.
Seattle.
Get one in Seattle. I just did one in Seattle. Maybe I do Portland or something like that.
Yeah. Let me know.
Okay, man. Last but not least, what's next for Kevin Neeld, man?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think over the next several months and into the next year, I'm hoping to revamp my website and kind of dust off the newsletter as well. And
there we go. Nice.
I'd mentioned before that our athletes are consuming information from social media. That's been one of the major driving forces for me starting to get back out and put some content on there to, helpfully, again, just kind of slow drip information in front of some of the players that maybe sparks some information or sparks conversation, or, maybe lets them know that I am looking at some of the same information that has caught their interest as well. So, I'm going to continue to do my best to stay active on Instagram and through some of the other social media accounts, and then continue to share information. I feel pretty strongly that I have benefited tremendously in my career from some of the information that people like yourself and Eric and Mike Boyle and many others have donated really a lot of their time to share with the industry and for people that are up and coming through it. So, I want to do my part to try to help give back as well.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, Kevin, it's always great catching up with you. I know you are super busy, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this. Where can my listeners find out more about you? Tell me about the social website, all that good stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I think the 2 main spots, my website is just kevinneeld.com. And then my Instagram handle is just @KevinNeeld. So I'm pretty easy to find there, but, you can hit me up through the contact page on the website too, or, through any of the social media channels. So, that's it. It's the best place to find me.
I love it, man. We'll make sure we get the links in the show notes. And again, Kevin, so great catching up, man. Thanks for coming on.
Cool. Thanks, Mike.